Thank you. Well, I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a project that I've worked on for probably the last 6 years. But I'm going to talk about it in a different way that speaks to a little bit of what I'm doing here at Denison over the next year or so. So the type of journalism that I do is, first of all, I don't actually usually introduce myself as a journalist. I tend to introduce myself as a narrative or nonfiction, fact-based storyteller, because I've had the privilege of working across forms everywhere from documentary to long-form magazine journalism and books. So when I say narrative, I mean the form, and when I say immersion, I mean a tool of information gathering. So when I think of research, I think of digging for story. Just to clarify for folks that aren't as clear about what immersion is it's much closer to doing a documentary on paper or taking anthropological skills and applying them to journalism. So the way that I like to define it is that immersion is about waiting. It's not about finding a story to fit inside your pre-constructed ideas. It's about actually taking the time to see what story is most important, what bubbles to the surface. There's usually a lot of options, but it's not about going in and saying, I want to write a story about X and looking for someone to represent that for me. So I spent my 20s inside rural South Africa, and I had the privilege of working in post-apartheid South Africa and focusing on local journalism, despite the fact that I was a foreign reporter. And so I ran a newsroom. In addition to writing for publications in Australia and across Europe, I spent most of my time running a newsroom with reporters that I had trained, and then taking that training program and training women reporters to sit inside local newsrooms across the country so that they could see stories that were pertinent to them inside their local paper, as opposed to only seeing stories that were taking place in the urban spaces, mostly urban townships. Most foreign reporters say there's usually a story that breaks them, that sends them home. Despite the fact that I reported on Mugabe's regime and xenophobic riots, it was not the story in Southern Africa that broke me. It was a story that dragged me back home. This is my Aunt Debbie. She was 20 years older than me, and my mom's youngest sister, who was 17 years older than her. Debbie was someone that when I grew up, I kind of thought was absolutely amazing and fascinating, but in the same breath, my family would say, you look like her, and you act like her, and yet she's a little crazy. So as a kid, I thought she was amazing. I spent as much time as I could with her, which was limited. But there's a distance that is created when family says something like that. My Aunt Debbie went missing in 2009. She was an artist, she was an actress on the stage in her 20s. In her 30s, she focused mostly on visual art, which was something that she did throughout her entire life. And in her 40s, she wrote. So when Debbie went missing, because I'm a journalist, I started doing what I do. I was in South Africa, and at night when I wasn't working, she went missing on the island of Maui, and so the time change allowed me to pretty much work 24 hours a day and to be on the phone and track down people she knew and places that she went to through the letters that she wrote. But I ended up coming home because after working with a private investigator, we had a whole lot of questions and not a lot of answers. So when that happens, and I'm the youngest of 6, everybody tends to flock home. So I moved in with my parents at 30, which was not what I thought I was going to do, in part so that I could start digging into all of the artifact that we had left over. So I spent weeks and weeks going through the closets my mother never wanted me to dig through, and started gathering images and started gathering letters. Now, the one thing that Debbie did that I miss terribly is write letters. She wrote some of the most beautiful, long, double-sided, handwritten letters, and because she moved a lot and she knew my mother would be worried about her, she always wrote at the bottom of those letters people who had phones and their names and their telephone numbers, just in case my mom wanted to use them one day, which my mother never really did. But I had all of these objects, and at the end, I still had an enormous number of questions. I found myself not looking for her and trying to solve a cold case. I found myself trying to understand her. That if there was so much in me that my family saw her as a part of me, and the more I got to know her through these letters, I saw a part of myself inside of her. My question was, what are the parts of her life that I'm missing? And so I'm a journalist, and therefore I started reporting. I packed up my bag. This was the summer in between my first and second year in a PhD program, which I was somewhat hiding out in. And I decided I would spend 4 months looking for Debbie through the people, places, and things she left behind. That meant being the person who knocks on someone's door and says, so 20 years ago, there was a room that faced south that had 2 windows and that looked like maybe it was once a porch. Does that still exist? And if it does, could I come sit in it for a while? My aunt used to live in there. It meant being okay with landing in a place and seeing that the building had been torn down. It meant tracking down some of the artwork that she had sold along the way. So she had a history of living in New York City, always with the same exact job, and then she would get chutful, which is a good Afrikaans word, that she wanted to live off of her art. She no longer wanted to live the rat race, and so she would move to these small arts communities across the country. And so I seesawed all summer long between basically following her timeline. As a reporter, though, it meant that I still had a whole lot of holes. I got to know her more. I discovered people that she probably never wanted us to know, or never wanted my mother to know. I discovered the discrepancy between the narrative that she told my mother versus the narrative that she would write to me, and thought about the reasons that we tell certain people things and the reasons we don't tell them certain things. So I ended up kind of backtracking and thinking about what McPhee says to us about the structure of profile, and starting to think back of a really classic narrative, Sinatra Has a Cold, where Gay Talese does not actually have access to Sinatra. So if Sinatra is X and I've been mandated to write a profile on Sinatra, then I need to go all the way around Sinatra and talk to everybody who knows him well to get as close as possible to the heart of who this person is. And so that's really what I ended up having to do with my aunt. But as a journalist with so many holes, I had to figure out, how do we glue this narrative together? Kicking and screaming, that did mean that I had to be inside this space, which was something I had never done. I think a lot of nonfiction writers start by writing essays and memoir, and I had always really pushed back against that. I was somebody who was really driven to tell other people's stories. I did what I call shut up and listen journalism. And this was really difficult for me because shut up and listen journalism doesn't apply when you need to figure out why you're telling this story and how you fit inside of it. So I jumped down a whole lot of rabbit holes. What I want to talk about here is a little less about the book that this ended up creating. I will say I started from scratch 3 times, and every single time it was a totally different format. But I want to talk a little bit about just how much research goes into writing these, despite the fact that you can pick up a really great work of narrative nonfiction, and it can read like a novel, as a lot of people say. But that the reality is that the amount of research in it is kind of crazy, and sometimes 3 days of research end up being 1 line inside of your book. So these are the first 2 pages of my book, and this is what the first half, or those first 3 paragraphs, look like in terms of research. And that's what the second page is. Which only goes to show there's a whole lot of rabbit holes that you have to jump down. Just to write these 2 pages, I had to research and understand the irrigation system where my Aunt Debbie went missing. So she went missing on the east side of Maui in this little sliver where the rain falls most and where most of the water that is irrigated and funneled to agriculture throughout the island goes to. And so despite the fact that it was only a paragraph, I spent weeks on end trying to understand this irrigation system. So a part of me, because this is a very personal work, it's taken forever because it's so personal, and because I still am a journalist and I still felt the need to everything be absolutely accurate and for you to learn so much more than Debbie's story and so much more than the questions I was asking about myself. That when you spend that many days working on things, you wonder, is it really worth that much work for a paragraph? And so it's this work that, because I was shape-shifting in form and starting to include myself and starting to push back boundaries that I had never pushed through before, that I started thinking about the many ways in which this really important research could be utilized. That it wasn't just my aunt's story. And so I found myself, and part of the reason why it's taken so long, 6 years for me feels like a long time for a single book, but in part it's because I gave myself permission to write and create in other forms. So when you came in here, you saw on the screen, I sort of say one story in 7 ways. The book is the end game, in the same way when you're working on a scholarly article and you're doing research with the aim of writing a scholarly article, the article or your book is the end game. But I realized that this story that cracked me open also made me realize how much more I could be doing with everything that I was researching. So the first is the most obvious and it's the most traditional. For me, I needed to talk about process because this was also new to me. I needed to talk about process a lot more. Also, publishing about process made me feel like I could justify the 6 years I was putting into it. It wasn't just a giant, vacant space for me. So the traditional approach was that I was also writing literature reviews and book reviews, things that helped me think about the work that I was doing and the space within the canon that I fit. So that's traditional, that's insider baseball. We're talking to our peers. But the thing that I was most interested in were the rabbit holes that I jumped down that helped me understand missing persons in America in a way that was not appropriate to tell in my aunt's story. It was a totally different book, which is why I started from scratch 3 times. Because I didn't really know what I was doing. I knew in the end that the story that was most important was the story about me and my aunt, and by default, my mother. But in the process, I was learning that we actually have a crisis in this country around missing persons, and it's a crisis that a lot of people know about. I feel like a mini expert at this point, but I was meeting experts every day who in most cases were amateurs. So I have a series of articles that I've been working on over those 6 years that will, strategically come out when my book comes out, but they were all done in an effort not to the side of the book, but an effort to understand this larger story. So what I understood is when we filed a missing persons report for my aunt, that the police looked at us and said, this is just a piece of paper. What are you actually expecting to have happen? Because she wasn't a child, which would be your Amber Alert, and she wasn't a senior citizen or disabled, which would be your Silver Alert, she was just a piece of paper even in a digital age. She went into a filing cabinet in the Maui Police Department, never to be looked at again. We hired a private investigator and we had me, so we had the 2 of us looking for her, but other than that, no one was looking for her, and they made it pretty clear that that was the case. So I started deep diving into what is the actual state of missing persons, how do we try to link people, and I found out that several months before my aunt went missing, NamUs, which is a database that the federal government paid to have developed, launched. And it allows you to put in missing persons cases, and it allows you to put in unidentified remains, and it's constantly searching and cross-referencing. But presently in the United States, the police are not required to actually put that data in, and coroners are not required to put that data in, which means you're limited in what they're cross-referencing. So I found out that actually the guy who designed NamUs lived in a double-wide in the hills of Tennessee and worked in a factory by day, and when the internet came about and he had dial-up, he has been our #1 amateur sleuth, and that most missing persons cases in America are solved by amateurs and not by our police department. So that has led me into being able to write about those things, even though those rabbit holes I jumped down helped me understand my aunt's story, but they weren't my aunt's story. So they were really those cuts on the bottom of the editing room floor that I couldn't bear to not have people know. The other is small, unrelated investigations. I like to think that they're related. They're kind of unrelated. They're much more related to my obsessions. So the federal government says that there's around 120,000 unidentified remains in America. There's a warehouse outside of Cleveland that's temperature controlled that has unidentified remains. There are boxes in the back of police departments that have bones that are unidentified remains. I have done crude calculations with my mini investigation to estimate at this point, because it's not done, that we probably have closer to 600,000 unidentified remains across America. That does not include all of the remains that are buried in the desert that the police along the border bury when there are immigrants that die along the way crossing. So that leads me to another way to tell the story. This is the one that as a journalist, I've had a lot of people push back. But in the last couple years especially, I've been working with local newsrooms across the country to try and address critical coverage gaps, to place young journalists in newsrooms to not just boost their numbers, but to address really important coverage gaps that help our democracy function better. In that process, I started paying attention more to what was happening in the State House and the link between local journalism and the State House legislation. And most often, State House representatives are actually presenting local news reports as their evidence for things. Now, I am no longer in a newsroom every day. I'm not interested in being in a newsroom every day, but the research that I do can help figure out how to link those NamUs, those two sides of NamUs together by requiring coroners to file and police to file. And the only way that's going to happen is at the state level, because the federal government has had it's been stuck in committee for years and years and never been passed through. So there's a possibility, but for some reason it's blocked. So the only way is to actually get state houses, to get legislative representatives to say, this is important, but I have all the research. So why should everybody reinvent the wheel? And as journalists, there's so much research that we do, whether we're a daily journalist or a long-form journalist. And so part of what I'm doing, which is kind of against what some people would say is my role and the ethical boundary, but I'm putting kits together for state legislators. And then there's legislative researchers simply have to find a family to be the face of that bill. So part of doing this is I'm a neat freak at home, but I'm a hoarder as a storyteller. And I had no real understanding what I was doing when I was kind of going out looking for my aunt's story through the people, places, and things she left behind, but I was sure gathering a whole lot of stuff. People gave me gifts that she had given them. People gave me some of her artwork after I'd tracked them down. I found classified ads that she posted when she moved to a city and looked for roommates and for other purposes. And I took a whole lot of my own notes. I have video footage of me sitting in a park in Oregon talking after this very strange interaction. I have audio recording of me. I have audio recording of interviews. I have photographs of places that she lived and photographs of people that I spent days with after knocking on their door and finding them unexpectedly. And I have so much stuff that I really was kind of drowning in it. But one of the things that I've done, because it actually doesn't take an enormous amount technologically, and it took me a little bit to sort of learn how to do this and some help from some tech friends, is that I'm working on this app that overlays Google Earth and overlays all of my research so that you can go in and in some ways, it's still curated, right? But in some ways, you can choose where you want to deep dive. You can look at some of the raw documents. You can listen to some excerpts from interviews. You can see images of people and places. You can hear the sound of the railroad tracks right by her house. And so this is really about storytelling in a totally different form. It's all the same facts that are in my manuscript, but you can feel a different story when you engage with it in this way. It's still journalism, it's still fact-based narrative. So, one of the things about this manuscript that was really difficult to work on is that I wasn't intending on trying to go after a cold case. But in the process of digging into the case went warm, and a body was found in the rainforest of Maui. Now, the only reason, and I'm here to say the only reason we were able to bring my aunt home and bury her is because we hired a private investigator. Had we not hired a private investigator, her body would have been found and would have been an unidentified remains in a coroner's in Maui. So I hiked out she was found, I don't know why anyone writes fiction. She was found by a wild boar hunter in eastern Maui who plays the ukulele by day for weddings. And he hunts once a month. The permits for hunting are pretty limited. He hunts once a month to feed most of his family. And I disappeared for most of a semester of my PhD program and was able to go out with him and hike to where her remains were found. Now, the one thing my aunt did is every time she moved, she sent a whole lot of objects to a number of my siblings and cousins, things that were important to her, but that she knew she couldn't take on a bus moving to Oregon, or she couldn't take when she was moving to a commune in Mineral, Virginia. And this was one of the last things that she sent me. She sent it all the way to South Africa. My great-grandmother made it. It weighs a ton. She must have spent a fortune sending it all the way to South Africa, and I'm amazed it even made it in the mail and wasn't stolen, but it arrived. And I was inside this little studio in Pittsburgh, inside this old Polish social hall, that I started accumulating more and more and more and more and more. And a friend of mine, who was visiting, who's a fine arts photographer, said, "We need to sort of dig you out of here." And so she and I spent a couple weeks digging me out of the objects and pulling them together and sort of packaging them with archival quality and trying to basically get me out of her life. My studio smelled like the rainforest. But it had a lot of objects in there that she had sent to me or my mother, objects that she'd sent along the way to different people in the family. That's an object that someone gave to me that she had loaned them, and it has all her notes in it. When I went out hiking, this is the first thing I saw in the rainforest when I turned the corner, and I knew that everything that she had was out there. So there's a lot of people who live off the grid in eastern Maui, and my aunt had built herself basically a tiny house out there. And I knew that we'd found the right place because I can tell you exactly when she bought that. She had wanted one of those, it weighs like 25 pounds, for so long, and when she built her little tiny house and she had a scooter in Maui, she wrote me a letter about how she scootered with this damn thing, it's 25 pounds, and carried it up there with her. And that was the only thing I cared about carrying out with me on that first day. So what I ended up doing was working with my friend Kija, and as we buried me out, we took all of those images. And those images then, after that, allowed me to write about these objects, as a part of her, as my own personal experience. And they led to some of the strangest experimental writing I've ever done in my entire life. Absolutely nothing close to my journalistic work, but it's just as valid and just as part of the story. And so this is the last place that I would have thought I would see my work, but we have a gallery exhibit that is both text on the wall and images that tell the story in a different way. And honestly, that enters me into a space of different conversations and a different audience than I ever would reach with my book, or I ever would reach with a series of articles or my small investigation. But through it, you are still learning all of the same stories. There's just a different focal lens, or it's filtered through something with a new purpose. So all of this brings me back to really just what I do, which is what is the seventh way, which is packaged in a book form. But I wanted to share this because this is really important to me. Someone gave me this quote a long time ago. I didn't have where it came from until somebody after a book talk came up and told me I know where that came from. But someone gave me this quote when I was reporting in South Africa, and every time I started a new notebook, I wrote the quote on the back, because it was a reminder for me about what I was doing. And it's from Eudora Welty's book that was actually from sort of the documentary era in the US, where we had these photo and documentary books, which are kind of controversial now, but my wish, my continuing passion, would be not to point the finger in judgment, but to part a curtain, that invisible shadow that falls between people, the veil of indifference to each other's presence, each other's wonder, each other's plight. And that's really the driving force for my manuscript, which is that. So that is it.